Our speaker this morning is someone whose leadership and insights I greatly appreciate. I certainly wouldn't be on the path that I'm on right now without the gentle nudging and guidance he provides. And every time he speaks, I take notes and hold the microphone further away from me. This morning, Reverend Brian Walker will share his thoughts on fierce compassion.
Good morning. Thank you, Bob and Gail, and thank you, Rita. So our theme for the month is compassion. And compassion is, of course, one of the... Oh, those guys back there can fix that, can't they? Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I know you're not sleeping back there. I don't care what these people think. I know you're not. So our theme for the month is compassion, which is, of course, a virtue that all the wisdom traditions have taught for thousands of years. And, you know, compassion is simply the idea of seeing people suffering and wanting to do something and doing something so that the word itself means suffering together, compassion, suffering together. So you suffer with them and intervene in some way. Now, a couple of years ago, I spoke on the subject of self-compassion, which is one of those topics that positive psychology and those who are doing that kind of research have been doing for the last couple of decades. And so one of those researchers, Kristen Neff, started studying self-compassion. And she described that there were three components to it. One is a kind of mindfulness that we keep what's happening with us in balance in terms of pain and the other stimuli that we're getting from the world. And the second thing is a common humanity, that we have a feeling and that we identify with the rest of the human species, that we see ourselves as one of those, and thereby are deserving of compassion. And the last thing was kindness, that we actually do things that are kind, instead of criticizing ourselves and being harsh with ourselves, that we treat ourselves kindly, particularly in circumstances where we don't do things as well as we might like. Has anybody had that experience? So what Kristen Neff has been studying recently is something she calls fierce self-compassion. And it really rather intrigued me, and it seemed particularly appropriate for these times. And actually, she wrote the book, because she has a book called Fierce Self-Compassion, that she wrote it with the idea that these times call for this. And before I actually get into describing what that's like, I want to tell you a little story. So Kathy and I are watching a nature show the other night. And it's about the Okavango Delta. Now, if you don't recognize that name, you might, if you like to watch nature shows, you might have seen it. The Okavango Delta is actually one of the 7 wonders of Africa. And it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it has some notoriety, and particularly with the animal and plant life that are there. Because the Okavango Delta is in the Kalahari Desert in Botswana, and it is formed seasonally by the melting of the snow from the nearby mountains. And so there are trillions of gallons of water that come down the Okavango River, and out of this 5,800 square mile delta create this seasonal kind of change that is very remarkable. And of course, it has a very profound effect on the plant life and the animal life in the area. And so this particular documentary was about the effect and the importance of families and groups, and how they're affected when this seasonal change happens, when this water starts flowing in. It really changes the whole environment. And of course, since it's in a desert there, all of the animals are looking for this water, and they come to it. The other thing that is most interesting about the Okavango Delta is that water, all of that water that comes down there, does not travel on to a sea or ocean. And in the traditional cycle of the water cycle, that things, fall, the water falls down in the mountains, it rolls down to the ocean, and then it evaporates. All that water evaporates directly without draining to a sea or an ocean. And that is one of the things that makes it so unique. Anyway, this particular show was about the families and how they're impacted. And they focused a lot on this pride of lions. And so this pride had been there for some time, and the pride male, which is the designated male, or the male who is dominant in the pride, and there's one, sometimes two, his job is to protect the lionesses and the cubs. Well, this particular pride, this pride male, was older, battle-scarred from fighting all these young guys who come up and want to take his place. And he was aging to the point where he really couldn't do his job. So when two young males who were really coming into their full maturity came to challenge him, he quickly saw that he was outgunned, and he left the tribe, the pride. And so what these two young males, in their infinite wisdom, you know how these young males are, they banished a young lioness that was a couple of years old and had not come into her maturity yet, just seeing her as another mouth to feed. So, and again, part of the point of the show is this is particularly challenging because this young lioness was out alone and not having the strength of the pride, because killing on your own and providing for that, as opposed to doing that as a group, is much, much more difficult. But she managed, and she was doing a good job. And during the time that she was out there, she came into her maturity. And so she was in season when another male shows up. And there's the potential there for them to create their own pride. And so they have a liaison for several days, is the way lions do. But this guy really wasn't the family type, and he moved on. So that left the lioness in an even more vulnerable situation, because now she has to provide for herself, and she's pregnant. So she manages. This is a lioness with chutzpah. And she has 4 cubs. And she's still, and so this is her burden, to do this alone with these 4 cubs. And she's doing great, and they're about 4 months old. And during that whole time, of course, she has to move them every day or two, because she doesn't want the scent around for them to get, for anybody to come and get them any prey that is available. So the time comes when these cubs are 4 months old, when these 2 males show up. And the law of the jungle is that a male lion, a pride male, will not allow a cub in his territory that is fathered by another male. So basically, that means that it's a death sentence for these cubs. And I think, to also to get the picture here, you have to realize this lioness is about half the weight of one of these males. And there are two of them. And all sense says to do what that other older male did, and that's to leave the scene. She didn't. And it's miraculous, the kind of footage that they get from these TV shows. But they had some close-ups of this young lioness challenging these two males. And it was very clear that she was ready to give up her life for her cubs. Now, during the ensuing interaction, fight, one of the cubs slipped away and one of the male lions got it and killed it. But she managed to save 3 of them. And it was that kind of, that energy that said, you can't do this to me and my cubs and my family. And that is what Kristen Neff calls fierce self-compassion. Fierce self-compassion. So let me just dig into this a little bit more deeply here, and I've got a slide or 2 here for you. So this is the idea of fierce self-compassion, and this is the part that Kristen Neff, the researcher, wanted to bring out. There is this tender self-compassion where we take care of ourselves. And we have suffering that we actually suffer from the outside world, but that we inflict on ourselves. And so to be compassionate with ourselves. And there's this fierce self-compassion that we take action to alleviate suffering that's going on out there, particularly as an example, as this lioness did. And so the way that Kristen sees it now is that there's a balance between these 2 kinds of self-compassion, this tender self-compassion and this fierce self-compassion. And so the fierce self-compassion provides 3 things. Protection, so that you can draw boundaries and say no, create some healthy boundaries when that's necessary for you so that you can protect and defend yourself and what is most important to you. Providing, to say yes to what our needs are, that we each have needs as we go through life, to acknowledge those and to say, yes, I need this and I'm going to get it. That is part of that fierce self-compassion. And the last thing is motivating, to learn, to grow, and to change the world. That this is a part of being in this world, that we grow, we evolve, we learn, and as we human beings, as conscious, we are consciously transforming ourselves and the community, the human family. We're evolving consciously. So the way that she frames it is you can see that there's a balance there and a yin and yang symbol, okay? And so that is part of that balance. But together with the tender and the fierce, it creates this caring force. So it's not using strength or power in a way that is going to be self-destructive or destructive to others, but it's a caring force, and that allows us to thrive. So that's an important part of what Kristen wants to share about self-compassion. So I have taken, and so there are 2 points that she makes about this. In a bigger kind of context. One is she writes about fierce self-compassion for women, okay? And so the title of her book is Fierce Self-Compassion, How Women can harness kindness to speak up, claim their power, and thrive. And the reason that she frames it that way is because she sees men as males as being more naturally with agency, that is, wanting to do things for themselves. And also the way they're socialized in most cultures is to cultivate that anger and to be the ones who are designated as defenders. But women also have this capacity, and she calls it fierce self-compassion. And like I say, she's done research on it. So that's one of the things, is that she very much says that this is something that women can cultivate. And the other point that she makes is that this is really important for our time. That for thousands of years, the balance between the male and female energy on this planet has been out of balance, and the male energy has been dominant. And we see the result. And female energy, that caring energy, needs to be put back in balance with this. And that's why she has that idea about caring force, that sometimes it can be necessary to use force, but where does that energy come from, and what does it mean? So taking a little bit of poetic license with her, with her idea, I also extend that to those males who have a more dominant female side, who actually are more in touch with their feminine side than they are with their male side. And they're all out there. I identify with that. So I want to tell you about an example that I classify, and this comes from the scripture, from the Gospels, about that identifies fierce self-compassion. And it's the story of Jesus and the money changers, is the way that it's usually labeled. And so let me set this up for you. So in Jerusalem, there's the temple, and this temple is in a huge courtyard. And the temple sits in this huge courtyard. And so what happens, and what has been traditional in Jewish religion forever, has been to sacrifice animals at the temple. And that's something that you come and you do, and you sacrifice an animal. And people come from a long way to do their animal sacrifice. And so it's common that instead of bringing a kosher animal miles and miles, sometimes hundreds of miles, that you could come there and buy one. And that this would be the animal that you would sacrifice, that you would offer up. And what is needed in addition is, because there was not a currency that was common to everyone around there, you needed to have the money changer there so that you could get the right currency and pay the temple tax. That was what was important, is that you were paying the temple tax. So Jesus came, and I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with the story. He throws the tables over. He actually has a scourge or a whip, and he's throwing everything over and says, "Get out of here." And this is an example of how many people talk about him being angry and showing how he wants to really preserve the tradition. So historically, we can look at this as Jesus commenting on, or I should say, let me back up just for 1 second. So what happens is, after he creates this kind of kerfuffle, he starts teaching. And this is one way that you can see that this is what this has been set up for, is he wants to do this teaching. And what does he say? He says, "You have made a den of robbers out of the sacred temple." And so what does that mean? Historically, we can look at this, particularly in line of the other criticisms that he's made of the Pharisees and how they pay lip service to spirit and spiritual practice and are much more interested in the form than the true reality of it. And in addition, how they are dominating the other people and making them conform. And in this case, what Jesus is criticizing and fighting against, and what I call showing this fierce self-compassion, is that those in the authority are actually fleecing a lot of people because of these exorbitant temple taxes. And so they are maintaining this structure that has them at the top, and they are keeping people poor. And that's been a theme of Jesus, is when you look at historically how you look at this. Now, metaphysically, we can look at the temple as our consciousness. That the temple represents our consciousness, our awareness of ourselves and what's happening. And that these money changers are dishonest brokers of things that would take us away from anything that keeps us in touch with our divine selves. And Jesus, again, metaphysically, is saying, no, you can't do that. Whatever the addictions are, whatever takes you away from that awareness of your divine consciousness, your Christ consciousness, that is not appropriate. So don't pay attention. Kick the money changers, those thoughts that really detract you from knowing who you truly are. Kick them out and show that fierce self-compassion and say, no, I am divine. I am a child of God, and I can act from and choose that energy of a being of love and light. Now, I will add one other thing here, and that is Paramahansa Yogananda, who I know many of you are familiar with, and who founded the Self-Realization Fellowship, and who's written extensive commentaries about the Gospels, which I recommend to you if you have the interest. His take on this is that he thinks that Jesus has staged the whole thing anyway, and that he actually is in total control, but is really just making a big scene here, and because he has this teaching that he wants to do. So the way that I frame this again is that, Jesus' teaching is to love your enemies. And at the same time, meek is not weak. Meek is not weak. And he shows that what I am labeling this fierce self-compassion in this demonstration that he does. So I also see this conflict that we're having in the Ukraine as one way you can look at fierce self-compassion. And let me frame that for you. The Russian viewpoint is that the Ukrainians and Ukraine has always been a part of Russia. The truth of the matter is that Ukrainians have their own language, they have their own culture, they have their own history. And even though for hundreds and thousands of years, they have been dominated by other cultures, including, of course, the Russians, but Poles, Lithuanians, and Mongols, so that they've had a challenge because they're this large country out there that's kind of flat and is in between these moving powers. But they still have had their own sense of nationalism. So towards the end of the 1800s, a Ukrainian poet wrote a poem titled, "Ukraine Has Not Yet Perished," which is now their national song. Ukraine has not yet perished. So after the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, the Ukrainians had a referendum about whether they wanted independence. And in a fair election, 92% said, yes, we want independence. And so in spite of an agreement to honor that independence, Russia has been interfering in Ukrainian life in various ways by getting involved in their elections, by cutting off the gas lines and the energy that goes to their country, by inciting and supporting independence movements within the country in eastern Ukraine, and of course in 2014 by seizing control of the Crimea. So it's been a very blatant kind of intervention in Ukraine. And that's on top of a history in which during the time that Stalin was in power, and that's back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, when he went through his rigorous collectivization program, Ukraine, of course, is a breadbasket for Eastern Europe and for actually a lot of the world. And so as part of that Soviet collectivization, he went over there, Stalin ordered his minions over there, and they took all that grain and took it back to Russia so that millions and millions of Ukrainians starved. And they remember that. So when they got the opportunity to be independent, they said yes. And they have been experiencing what I think arguably is the greatest gift of Western culture, and that is individual freedom under democratic law. And so I recently read in a magazine about a young female artist and an art teacher who was quoted as saying, "I'd rather be dead than be a Russian." And this for me is part of the way that I frame this as around fierce self-compassion. That, we expect the males to, go out there and do what they're supposed to do. But I think that there is, metaphorically speaking, this kind of baby that they have felt, this incipient, this beginning democratic independence, and they're not going to let it die. And that, to me, is an example of fierce self-compassion. I further see this conflict, this particular conflict, as the last clinging powers or expression of this dark male patriarchal energy that's been out of balance and that's unhealthy. And that the Ukrainian people, and particularly the Ukrainian women who have really been so fierce about this, are helping to rebalance that. And it's something that as we evolve, we the human species evolve consciously, that we're all called to do. So anyway, I invite all you ladies to embrace that fierce self-compassion that is in you, and to combine that with the tender self-compassion that you already have and that we all have, to protect, to provide, to motivate all of us to get on with this human evolution and evolving our consciousness. So I'll just close by saying that, the Dalai Lama says, if you want to be happy, practice compassion. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. And I would just add to that, make it tender and fierce self-compassion. God bless you.